on at the moment. So please do. Also, just in terms of managing the bandwidth, please keep yourself muted again and with your cameras off for the time being. Having dispensed with the formalities, we'll go ahead and get started again with apologies for the technical difficulties getting everybody logged in. My name is Sam Greene. I'm director of the Russia Institute here at King's College, London, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's conversation, which is a conversation that's been a very long time in the making. This is an opportunity to celebrate what is always an exciting achievement, which is a book by a colleague. But this is a doubly exciting moment because this is a book really that I think has the potential to force us to think about Russian politics in ways that maybe we are not used to, maybe in ways that aren't always comfortable. But that's what good scholarship and good thought, right, is there for, right? The book, I don't actually have a physical copy of the book because Amazon hasn't sent it yet, but Gulnaz was holding it up earlier. You want to hold it up to the screen again, Gulnaz? This is the book, right? The Red Mirror was published just a month and a half ago or so by Oxford University Press, right? So it is about as fresh as they get. Gulnaz is reader in Russian politics at the Russia Institute here at King's College London, is actually coming to us from Washington, which to a certain extent is home. Gulnaz holds a PhD from George Washington University and joined us after a number of years at the Haviker Center in the Department of Public Science at Miami University of Ohio, but came to help us set up the Russia Institute back in 2013, and is genuinely one of the most versatile political scientists I have ever had the pleasure to know and to work with. So again, an honor and a pleasure to talk about this book this evening. To introduce the book and to get the conversation started, right, is another name that needs, I think, very little introduction, if any, in this circle. Maxim Trudolyubov was among the founders of Vedomosti, which until relatively recently, right, was the newspaper that we all had to read if we wanted to know what was going on in Russia. Things have shifted a little bit, but Maxim is now editor-at-large of Meduza, which probably not accidentally is a news source that we all really need to be reading if we want to understand what's going on in Russia. Maxim was also a scholar at the Kennan Institute and a senior advisor for the Kennan Institute program, the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington again, and where he runs the Russiophile blog and podcast. Again, very much worth paying attention to if you want to understand what's going on in and around contemporary Russia. The format is as follows. Maxim's going to talk about the book for a little while, maybe 15, 20 minutes, get us provoke us a little bit. Gulnaz will respond, and then we will open it up to with the group. If you do have questions, please do go ahead to and post them. You can deal with them that way. Somebody's microphone is on, so I'm going to ask if you're not presenting or not asking a question to keep your microphones off again, just so we manage all of the sound around this. Again, one more reminder, do bear in mind that this is being recorded. Maxim, the floor is yours.
Hello, Sam. Hello, Gulnaz. Hello, everyone. I cannot see anyone, actually. Is this because I think I'm using this for the first time, the Teams? Anyway, so thank you for having me, and thank you for entrusting me with reading the book, one of the first readings, and I have to say that I actually sympathize with the book, so I'm not going to be like a big critic here, and I think that it's the premise is something that resonates strongly with me. Somebody who was growing up in the Soviet Union, and I'm from Moscow. I grew up in Moscow, and I remember well, the 80s pretty well in the Soviet Union, and looking back retrospectively. And this is accidentally something that I've found in the very beginning, in the I think preface to the book, that Gulnaz is mentioning something similar to my own recollection, and something I keep going back to is talking to my actually grandparents rather than parents, and realizing that they were those people for whom this society, the Soviet society, was a home, and they were pretty much they were the kinds of good people that I kept meeting in the West, traveling to places like Washington or Berlin, and people, especially older people, who would take their country seriously and would take care of it and think of themselves as part of it, and try to be good citizens. And in my recollection, my grandparents were those good citizens. My grandpa, for example, when he retired, he went to work for as a kind of a court clerk, completely just without any pay. That was his sense that he was, helping his country, and that was all very, very real for them. And then it changed, and for all the other generations, my parents included, and my generation too, we see that there is, I think, a really fundamentally different life, a fundamentally different kind of life that you live within a certain national identity, and a life that you live with, when you have to go through an episode just like the collapse of the Soviet Union, when your national identity collapses. And I think I agree that it probably is the central historical event that we all went through. And then after that, everyone was trying to cope in his own way, inventing strategies and dealing with that somehow. So it's just to say that probably any human society, anyone living through this kind of collapse, would go through probably a pretty similar change, and probably if Americans or the French or anyone or the Japanese had to go through an ordeal like that, they would probably react to they would have a difficult time. It's just to say that then when we look from the West, we or other people look from the West at Russia, they see this mess, and they see a people who react to a leader who seems a nationalist to some, a restorer of the Soviet empire to others, or some other evil figure. But to many people inside Russia, domestically, he has brought a certain feeling of a newly found identity. And I probably agree that, yes, that was probably about an identity. Or, as I was recently reading a lot because of the recent elections in the United States about this word normalcy that was mentioned a lot during the campaign, and especially it was kind of sort of connected with Joe Biden, because many said that he is the guy who is bringing some normalcy back, and there is a certain there are certain values that some people in the States, presumably Democrat rather than Republican, associate with what normalcy is. But then there is other normalcy. That's a long story. I won't go into that. That it more isolationists in case of the United States. And in Russia, I think this something similar happened in the sense that people were longing for some normalcy to get back to, and that included a shared sense of identity. And apparently it was really a traumatic experience of that loss, which originally in the 90s, I think we kind of had a muted feeling of, because we were just so busy, and we had to, many of us, we were very young at the time, basically surviving and doing jobs and never thinking about issues of being a collective something, but more being hugely and terribly individualistic at the time. So it all started to return later with time. And I think Putin was incredibly lucky that at a certain point, when people sort of woke up from this original individualistic frenzy of doing jobs and trying to feed themselves and support their families, and then realizing, looking around, that they needed a little bit more, just something more than just food and shelter, and some collective identity. And here was Putin, and that is my understanding, the kind of my takeaway from Gulnaz's book, that this was his contribution, that he was right there, right time, right place, with some sort of a number of values, a number of attitudes, and using that metaphor, the book is using a kind of a mirror that everyone can, look at and see something that's and recognize something in there. That probably is true, but I have to say that, well, to a certain extent, even I would feel that, yes, it kind of feels really great to be part of something big. And I remember that when I was in school, especially younger grades, that felt incredibly good to be part of a huge country, obviously the best country in the world, with the best. For some reason, the cosmonauts were the best, and the rockets. That wasn't something really important. But then it kind of faded away, and with age, other things became important. And I think that to a certain extent, what happened is that this new identity that Putin offered to Russian society was a highly curated and very narrow understanding of this shared identity. It sort of was a highly partisan and very limited view of what it meant to be Russian. And I think that this very narrowness and this ability, or this project, the Kremlin's project of essentially holding only one mirror and trying to limit everyone's attention to this just one way of presenting Russianness, is not is not actually being well received. It's no longer doing a great job, I think, in Russia. I think that Gulnaz is right, that there was a moment probably after the Crimean, of the annexation of Crimea. But I think, as we can see now, it was pretty brief. And although it felt rather long, I remember that it felt kind of long, but in the end, I think it's pretty brief. That and it probably ended sometime around 2017, 18, something like that. And right now it's something else. And I'm not sure that this collective identity thing is all that there is. It's, I think that the partisanship and the dormant conflicts that Russia actually has, they play, I think, a very important role in what's going on, in the sense that we don't have real political parties. We don't have an open field for politics and for real public debate on issues of national importance, so that everyone has their ideas and thinking, and a lot is said on social media platforms and everything people can use to discuss things. But there's no such thing as a real national conversation. It's like being effectively suppressed, and that's why this is my feeling, at least, is that there are other identities within in Russian society that are being suppressed, neglected, artificially driven out of view, unable to express themselves, unable to find to find an expression in everyday public speech, in political discourse. Obviously, definitely not in elections, in political campaigning of any kind. So that the curated, heavily curated nature of this identity is kind of a big question to me. To what extent it's natural, and to what extent the Russian society's response to it is real, in the sense that people may or may not have been essentially deceived. And that is my question to myself, as well as to this way of thinking about a nation. And so this is one question I think that I have after looking at this way of or this discourse, of way of describing a nation, a state of a nation that we're looking into today. And the second is essentially about it's kind of chronological. It's about the time. What happens with time? Because we've seen this Crimean moment, which is true, and probably was the height of this national awakening in a way, and it was the height of many nationalist movements as well, that the Kremlin also tried to use, by the way, and many thought and feared at the time that Russia was turning like really nationalist, almost fascist, It was not just the officially supported, when everything that's very public in Russia is officially supported, state supported in a way. But there was some grassroots, some bottom-up nationalist movements at the time that appeared publicly, but they, I think, eventually did not prove viable enough or popular enough, and it's just interesting to see what's happening with this national or nationalist feeling that was at the height when most of the studies, as I understand it, were done in 2016 for the book. Is that right? And then what happens next? What happens in 2018, 19, and now? So, but I am, just to conclude, I think I'm very grateful for this new voice that is raised against this very nasty, I think, discourse of essentially blaming ordinary Russians for their some kind of natural predilection for dictatorship or some kind of authoritarianism. This, I'm sure, is wrong, and evoking things like Soviet mentality, or Soviet, using this meme that some of the Levada Center sociologists have been using, the Soviet man, is probably outdated, and that is true. And I'm sure there are other ways of looking at Russia's at the situation Russian society finds itself in. So basically, my question probably is, to what extent this the Kremlin's highly curated, highly domineering media presence, and the messages and the kind of techniques the state have been using are distorting this idea of a mirror, an idea of a national identity that people are presented with, in a way, in this mirror. Because many, myself, for example, included, I've been essentially deprived of any opportunity to see myself in that mirror. I haven't seen myself there, unfortunately, but I'm sure there is some kind of mirror there, out there. I'm definitely not definitely not unique. I'm not just this one kind of Russian, one kind of Russian, a unique being that cannot, find a sort of soulmate in other Russians. I'm sure we are many. So the idea is how to think about all those other possible shared identities that we theoretically might have in Russia, some kind of proto parties or groups that I'm sure Russia is very much able to produce, because Russia is diverse. It's a huge country. Society is definitely not monolithic in any way. It's very it's very different from place to place, from social group to social group, from all kinds of divisions within it, and the historical divisions. We're not going to that now, but obviously with this kind of history, with the Soviet history behind us, we do have those deep divisions between at least those who consider themselves the victims and those who sort of consider themselves the winners of the Soviet project they used to work for. Government agencies or secret services. security agencies, etc. So there are all kinds of divisions in there, and I'm sure they are potentially might produce a highly diverse and interesting and strange Russia that we don't know at the moment. So thank you for the book, Gulnaz. I think it's a great contribution to us looking at Russia and presenting Russia to the world, which I think is incredibly important. Just to conclude, and my final thought is that Russia, I think, has suffered a lot from the way it's been presented as a kind of an outlier, as some kind of a strange place, deviant culture that is sort of partly Western but not really. And I just would say to that try living through this kind of ordeal, through a complete breakup, a collapse of a national identity, and look at how you would react to that and how you would live through that. Thank you very much. I concluded that.
Thank you, Maxim. Sam, can I jump in?
Yes, please do.
I think for the benefit of our audience, we must have made a mistake of not allowing me go first and then Maxim reacting, because you know, the key ideas, obviously not many people have read it. I would say very few people have read the book yet. So I apologize to the audience for a bit of distorted starting of this conversation. I should have gone first and Maxim should have come second, but some of these things might have been easier if we were in the room environment. So just bear with us. Now, let me actually bring attention to some of the main intention and argument and some of the key concepts that make up the argument. And I will then react to Maxim's points and important questions that Maxim has raised. For me, the book started with realizing the big gap between the way I perceived Russia and the way that people close to me, my father, my brother, my cousins, were perceiving Russia. And to me, it was just an existential question, you know, as to what happened. If I stayed in Russia, you know, 25, 30 years ago, I might have perceived things the way they do. And here I am, a British scholar, you know, with American education. I perceive Putin, I perceive Russian politics and its direction in a very different way. And I wanted to understand what's happening and what explains this difference, and how do we understand, therefore, the ideas and shared perceptions of the Russian society, especially when we came to the point of post-Crimea euphoria with regard to Crimea annexation, where that stark gap between how the West saw political things evolving and how Russians themselves saw political things evolving within Russia, you know, couldn't be further from each other, right? So in some way, the analysis and the big question that motivated the book is this difference in perception of political evolution of Russia, and specifically such a high degree of support and popularity for Vladimir Putin, you know, especially in the period between 2014 and 2018, but also to a certain extent, you know, before that, and to a certain extent continuing that. And I guess my argument that I developed, and I'll share where I found my answer to this question, my argument is best fit to this period of post-Crimea years, but I think it actually speaks to you know, to the larger frame of reference as well. And you know, I'll speak with regards to Maxim's question, how long will it continue? Because as far as I'm concerned, the politics, the legitimation politics that have been chosen after Crimea and even before Crimea, at least since 2012, but to a certain extent was lurking in the background from the time Putin came to power, is going to continue and is there to stay. Now, its effectiveness might differ. So we can look at the period, the 3-4 years after Crimea annexation as the period of the most intense success of the politics of legitimation and of Putin's leadership strategy, the way it was conceived during that time. But some larger ideas would fit for the period before and after that as well. So when I started thinking about these questions, my first train of thought went in the direction of the concept of cognitive path dependence and the extent to which various thinking patterns or shared ideas, or in fact, I was thinking in terms of thinking patterns, as people are taught in a very specific educational system with a very specific number of books, theories, ideas fed to the population, and without access to the more pluralist set of ideas, especially in the field of political science, sociology, social sciences, how do these propensities for thinking might affect how people perceive things after the big change of the Soviet collapse. So I started in that direction, but in the end, I ended up in the field of social psychology and importing basically some very basic insights from social psychology theory, social identity theory, and insights that were applied before me in 2011 by social psychologists Steven Riker, Alexander Haslam, and Michael Plato, who applied social identity theory to leadership and who looked at leadership as a process connecting an individual leader and followers through certain ideas, so that in this process, the group members start seeing the leader as one of them, as doing it for them, as making sense of them, and as making them matter, right? So applying social identity theory to the analysis of leadership, to me, was an eye-opening moment to understand the significance or the roots, the successful, I would claim, Putin's leadership in Russia, and successful from the perspective of the shared group looking at him as a leader that represents the group, and in fact, the group being made in that process, right? The group that didn't exist before in terms of meaning structures being created as a part of that leadership process. So it's a very dynamic approach, that looks at leadership as a process. It's, it's very much beyond the idea that there is a person who should, great leaders idea, that leadership is sometimes looked at, there are great people there, like Alexander Makedonsky or Peter the Great. It's very much different idea from a person finding himself in the right moment and the right time. No, it's actually the idea that there is a process that connects the followers and leaders through those representations. And so once I found that theory, that application of social identity theory, I basically looked then at Putin's leadership as Putin, looking at politics as the art of the possible and making do with the context, the way at that moment, and engaging in the process of political construction during which he was able to really use the historical baggage of the Soviet Union and the cognitive structures, specifically in terms of collective identity, the Soviet collective identity structures. And in the book, one of the chapters, I go through at least two important pillars, which I think are important as a baggage, as a historical baggage that has been revitalized and has been tapped onto today. That is the sense of Soviet exceptionalism and the role of conflict as a structuring element, as a consolidating element for the Soviet society. Two elements I go over, I describe them, I go into secondary literature, I go through very interesting representation moments during, if you look at the bridge, the space bridge between the Russian Soviet audiences and the American audiences that were quite popular around 1986, around 1987. I remember Phil Donahue and Vladimir Posner. And if you look now 30, 40 years after those space bridges that were connecting different audiences, you just see those collective identity structures. Now, in the book, I also sort of go through some conceptual clarification of what I mean by identity and how identity actually can be looked at in very different ways. And once again, I found it to be helpful. Identity as a perception of self, as a collection of ideas about what the self is about, how we perceive ourselves. So ideas represented as cognitive structures or mental models, right? So if the collective Soviet identity is, if we look at it as a set of these ideas, that the Soviet nation is the most exceptional nation on earth, it fights for peace, and you belong to that, right? And you absorb, each individual has a piece of himself, which is that collective identity from which individuals draw a sense of self-worthiness, a sense of meaning, a sense of belonging to the larger body. So those are some of the key things. So on the one hand, historical baggage. On the other hand, in another chapter, I go through another constructivist take on collective trauma construction, and I build an idea about, in order to revitalize and to revive that collective identity template, something else needed to happen. And that something else was the transition of the 1990s that were represented by the Kremlin through constructing trauma against to make sense of that that period of time, that historical period of time in Russia. So constructing revival of the Soviet collective identity pillars occurs and becomes possible in the context when the 1990s become represented as this period of time when a lot of bad things happened, when Russia lost its not just identity but economy, leadership, and status, and sets of meanings that were important to individuals. So just two other concepts that I used to make sense of why both the Soviet identity structures and the 1990s are important for consolidating a sense of belonging to the Russian nation and linking that sense to Vladimir Putin and his leadership. I go to another political psychiatrist, actually Vamik Volkan, who spoke about the two important, he basically claimed that there is two things, a chosen trauma and a chosen glory, that become two important shared representations that work to consolidate communities. And if you look around the world at various nations, that many nations and many communities must have a certain historical event around which the sense of trauma, the sense of loss, the sense of grievance is constructed. But that's not the only thing. You also have a chosen glory, an event around which you have a sense of hope and promise and something positive to be proud of, right? And so in one of the chapters of the book, I basically equate and analyze how the 1990s and the construction, the mediated, the Kremlin-led construction of the 1990s as collective trauma period that very much resonates in the society, becomes that basis on which a lot of other ideas are built onto and create a sense of connection between the Kremlin, the leadership, and the people. Long as a lot of new policies, new ideas of the Russian government are linked and opposed to the 1990s, and it is explained why the Russian government is doing something, because they want to not to repeat the 1990s, because they want to they are taking the country away from that period of loss and chaos and anarchy and dislocation and trauma. That becomes something that is very resonant in the Russian society, and that again creates these emotional linkages and support for Putin's leadership. And so the chosen glory and the chosen trauma. Now the chosen glory part, I didn't go into it very elaborately, because that idea and that analysis has been done by many of my colleagues. And there, the chosen glory, of course, is World War II, the event of the World War II. That is one, as Gutkov mentioned, one sort of stolp, one sticking out point in the desert of Russian symbolic meanings around which Russians coalesce as a positive, as a sacred and meaningful event and sacred victory for Russians that gives them hope and strength and some type of promise for the future. So in the end, I guess there are two important elements to the book. One is I spent 2-3 chapters building the context, the historical context, and then I built the analysis of agency. And in some ways, I bring in the two parts of the puzzle, because sometimes political scientists look either at agency or at structures as two different elements that might be explaining the outcomes. I guess in my sense, I tried to avoid that chicken and egg problem, and I brought the two together and I argued, and that's where this leadership and social identity theory analysis of leadership helped me to do that. It helped me to bring those two elements together, because agency is not it's opportunistic, but it's not without any boundaries, right? Agency occurs within specific contexts and within specific constraints and boundaries. And I guess one can make a claim that Putin made the best out of the constraints and out of the opportunities he had, and he tapped into those hot emotional buttons of the Russian society by both first linking connecting to the society based on the idea of the transition being very painful and tragic and problematic and bringing a lot of loss, but at the same time bringing the promise that allowed people to connect to their earlier cognitive templates of the Soviet identity structures, of that sense of exceptionalism, of that sense of moral superiority, of that sense strength and promise that Russians lacked in the 1990s and that Putin was able to bring to them in the 2000s. And hence his leadership became this symbol of Russia coming up from its knees, becoming stronger, and once again standing up and showing its self-righteous worthiness to the West and to the rest of the world, etc., etc., etc. So those are some of the key ideas. And if I just may finish with actually a sentence from Vitaly Mansky. If you remember, he had the documentary, Putin's Witnesses. And I believe there is something very important he captured that wasn't noted by a lot of observers. In 2000, on the night of his first presidential victory, March 26, 2000, when Putin was not a nobody, but I guess a KGB officer who was, and the prime minister who was, it was decided by the Kremlin that he's going to run for president, and a whole group of political technologies were there to make that happen. And Pavlovsky was very sure that they can have anyone to bring as a president of Russia. Anyway, observing at that night of the elections, Putin announced, when he was congratulating his team, thanking his team at his campaign headquarters, he said the following, and I think that's very revelational of what happened in the last 20 years. He said, everything was so accurately calculated and psychologically grounded that it really provided the results on the streets and on the screens. Everything was built step by step and brought the results we are seeing now. I would like to thank you all and congratulate. It is your success. I think in some way, someone can look at the last 20 years of the Russian political evolution. And when we talk about Putin's leadership and a certain degree of effectiveness to his leadership, and the reasons why many outside, he has quite a degree of support among outside autocratic and populist leaders around the world, they admire him for that, specifically what he said, because he was able, and the Kremlin under him and the collective Putin under him were able to quite accurately calculate and psychologically ground the policies of legitimation and building support for the regime that occurred in Russia. Now, how long could it last? Before each presentation of this nature, I like to check what's happening on Vladimir Solovyov Evening with Solovyov. What are the ideas they're pushing onto the public, right? This is probably one of the not universally watched news infotainment channels in Russia, but it is watched by a large number of TV viewers who tend to be older. So of course we will talk about the differences, generational differences and such. But as far as it happened yesterday, the day before yesterday, the ideas of Russian exceptionalism, the ideas of the Russia being in many ways superior, in many different ways superior to the Western countries, to the outside world, whether it's a discussion of the new Russian vaccine, if you notice the 95% effectiveness of the vaccine, whether it is the discussion of historical memory and Nuremberg trials, which was the topic of the discussion yesterday, and again, the moral superiority of Russian, again, the topic of the Russian World War II and its meaning to Russia, all those ideas that represent the key frames, the key foundational elements for trying to maintain support for the Kremlin, the link between the Kremlin, the regime, and the state, link between looking at Putin's leadership as a leadership that builds Russia's sovereignty and strength. All those ideas are very much present in everyday news discussion in Russia today, which makes me think that that strategy of legitimation that was so intensely popular after Crimea is still ruling the politics and political construction in Russia today. Maybe I should stop at that. I know I didn't answer all Maxim's. Sam, you tell me.
Okay, well, thank you. Certainly a lot to talk about. So I would invite people in the audience to post questions to the chat. There are quite a number of you. And so I imagine there may be quite a number of questions. And I think if we deal with muting and unmuting, that could make things a bit difficult to manage. So please do go ahead and post to the chat, and I will read things out as they come in. But while you're doing that, right, I might just press you on one thing that Maxim brought up, to which I'm not quite sure I heard an answer, which really is this question of diversity, right? Where do we put people who don't see themselves in the mirror, right? Are we going to call them vampires, right? And that's sort of not part of this world, right? Or is there more to it than that?
So my response to this would be, and again, in the introduction to the book, I sort of very clearly address the fact that Russia is not singular. It's not a single voice, right? But identities are cognitive structures that exist at different levels, and identities are very multiple, right? We have gender identity, we have religious identity, we have professional identities, we have whatever, different sport fan and music fan, etc., etc. Now, because the media control is quite comprehensive, although again not universal, those who do follow the Kremlin-controlled media, the media strategy is to keep a focus, and I call it cognitive centrality or cognitive or salience of national identity. That is an important, if you will, as Russian commentators like to use the term technology, political technology, right? So you can look at the technology of maintaining the centrality of Russian nationwide national level identity to somehow not belittle, not to make other identities irrelevant, but as a to create support for the Kremlin, right? That very much relates to Maxim's observations that it's a highly curated and very narrow understanding. As I mentioned, there are not so many things to be proud about. World War II is chosen as a very, as one important thing around which people coalesce. Now, because if we start talking about, say, space or, other technological issues, well, Russians know that in terms of space and technological issues, Russia is not that far advanced. So that Soviet advancement just might show the problematic points in the technological prowess that Russia can demonstrate today. But no one would doubt, no one can disagree about the World War II and the victory. So the diverse identities are there, and but people are left to their own local devices to work through them, to make them important, and to the extent that those diverse identities might threaten with politicization, the Kremlin reacts quite, not repressively, but definitely, I mean, not violently, but definitely repressively, right? So if we talk, for example, about ethnic identities and cultural nationalism in Russia, many ethnic activists basically are brought to FSBs or somehow repressed because there is a danger perceived with the politicization of other local identities. So the only identity that is promoted as legitimate and as capable of producing political implication is the collective national Russian identity. Now, what do you do if you don't see yourself in that mirror, right? You various other choices. I mean, besides, you can always, many patriots, quote unquote patriots, would say you can always leave Russia if you don't like it. You can be apolitical, and you can be, sort of working in the, living in what Yurchak might say, deterritorialized worlds of your own community, quite detached from the national community, and look at the rest of Russia as, okay, there are those who watch Solovyov and who believe Putin, and here we have our own local things that exist in a not alternative reality, but just side by side in a parallel world.
Great. So we got a whole bunch of questions that are beginning to come in, right? So I'm going to read them out, try to see if I can group them together to an extent, but I am going to ask that we maybe keep responses brief so we can get through them as many of them as possible. One of the nice things about doing this online is we get people coming in from all over the place geographically. This is a deterritorialized seminar, right? So our first question is from Dmitry Goncharov from Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, who asks, was Putin's success a result of thoroughly planned and elaborated strategy, right? Or did it appear as a byproduct of a series of institutional adjustments and maybe some impulsive actions, such as the occupation of Crimea? So this is querying what you were saying about this idea that this was all sort of calculated and designed from the beginning.
Yeah, so we cannot, I mean, I would take away from that idea that it was totally calculated and designed from the very beginning. I don't think the Russian government and the Russian leadership was that far looking. I think there was a lot of learning in the process, but even looking at the 2000 speeches and the rhetoric that Putin wrote in Nezavisymaya Gazeta, I believe, when, and even if we look at very initial policy decisions, when the Soviet anthem was brought back, when a lot of symbolic, I remember the Russian education and Tsarnitsa and some Soviet practices were being returned to the Russian students and to the Russian schools. All those early elements that coexisted with the Kremlin's focus on on administrative reforms, on taxation, on liberal authoritarianism, on the markets, on the technological development, on rebuilding the state vertical, the political vertical, that coexisted, right? The symbolic elements were there already, but they started less visibly than what we saw from 2012, when very specific choices were made in response, arguably, to the events of the protest, political protest for fair elections in 2011 and 2012, when a decision towards wedge politics was made in the Kremlin to juxtapose the urbanized, the angry urbanized who were pro-change, cosmopolitan, accountable government, and the rest of the society who did not associate themselves necessarily with Muscovites and with angry urbanites. But again, a lot of media construction went into making such wedge politics and the focus on traditional values possible and the whole morality politics, and then focus on Russian distinct history, millennial history, civilization, and hence superiority. These ideas flourished and became central to building the legitimacy for the rulers once there was no other things like economic growth and energy prices there to support other performance-based legitimacy, let's say.
Okay, well, so that leads pretty well into a question from Natalia Forat at the University of Michigan, who is asking about the relationship between these issues of identity and authoritarianism. In other words, is it inherent, right, that these structural aspects of identity, right, as you said earlier, sort of choosing traumas and glory, right? Was this inevitably going to go hand in hand with authoritarianism? Can Russia democratize without undoing these aspects of identity?
This is a very important question, and I probably will have to think a little more than just give you an answer from my head. But I think the big question that is linked to this issue of authoritarianism and identity is, what were there? Did Putin as a leader have other choices, or were there other leaders who had other choices, say, with representing the 90s in a different way, and with not returning the Soviet ideas of exceptionalism, but actually building on the ideas of Russia as a normal country? Remember Daniel Treisman's and was it also Schleifer argument, right? Russia as a normal country, it doesn't have to be exceptional, right? So were there these choices? And here I am a bit of two-minded for the following thing. I do believe in political will, I do believe in ideological convictions, and I do believe that if Putin was a Democrat at heart, say, or a committed Democrat who wouldn't be afraid of losing power and who wouldn't be seen himself as beholden to the vested interests that would want him to hold on to power, I think there were opportunities for representing the 1990s in a very different ways. Mm-hmm. So the point about this constructive approach to collective trauma of the 1990s is exactly that no event in nation history is automatically traumatic, that any type of collective event, unlike personal events, collective events always go through mediation, through various media structures, literature, society mediation, media mediation, right? And again, Maxim brought also cases of Germany and Japan. If we compare Japan and Germany to Russia, post-imperial states with the lost status, etc., mm-hmm. The interesting correspondence of Germany and Japan with Russia is that all three countries went through lengthy periods of economic growth. In two countries, in Japan and Germany, these periods of economic growth were turned rhetorically into this concept of economic miracle. Mm-hmm. Japan went through economic miracle in the 60s. Germany went through economic miracle in the 60s. Now, one can say that Russia's economic growth from 1999 till 2007, 8 years of quite stable growing promise, could have been framed in the sense of, look, the society, we have suffered, but that suffering was for a purpose, for a reason. Look, mm-hmm. We have now the real results of the liberal reforms that were undertaken. That choice wasn't made; it was actually overturned, right? Mm-hmm. The choice, the electoral choice strategy that was chosen by Pavlovsky was the opposite. Mm-hmm. It was to bring all the losers from 90s as Putin's majority and to build this revanchist idea that now a leader comes who will not quite overturn, but who would be everything but Yeltsin. So the electoral choice that was made. Again, from political perspective, probably it was a smart decision, right? I guess Pavlovsky is a smart guy, but it was cynical, non-ideological, and it was based on power considerations solely, without taking into account the historical moment, the Soviet collapse, the communist, the choice, the anti-communist choice, the democratic choice. Those ideas were non-existent, and so that fork in the road, where there was a certain degree of opening, arguably, for a different framing of the growth period in Russia, and to make it similar to post-imperial condition in Germany and Japan, was actually used for the opposite purpose. And why I am double-minded about this is that if we look at 1998 and 1999, and we look at the leaders that were there, and we look at, again, where was history pushing Russia in 98 and 99? We see people like Primakov, we see people like Maslyukov, who are brought to power with very statist ideas. It's hard to think that, but Nemtsov was there, right? There was in 98 a moment when Boris Nemtsov was seen as a potential successor, right? So there was that leadership, but also this history of the 98 crisis worked against those choices, because it destabilized this faith in the liberal reforms and stuff.
So since you mentioned Germany and Japan, right, that invites a question about the extent to which some of these ideas travel, right? This is a book about Russia, but we're social scientists, so we want to think about these things more broadly, right? One of our guests, Anthea Norman Taylor, asks whether or not we should think about Boris Johnson's sort of use and instrumentalization of World War II and the Blitz mentality, right, as an attempt to use maybe some combination of chosen trauma and chosen glory, particularly the glory, right, to deal with the maybe unchosen trauma or semi-chosen trauma of Brexit.
Right.
But obviously in a very different context, right? Because we still think of the UK as a democracy, right? So this gets to Natalia's question as well about, is this a phenomenon that we should only be thinking about in authoritarian contexts, or is this
No,
something?
absolutely not. Absolutely not. And that's the power of the leadership perspective looked through social identity theory. It's actually perfectly applies to make sense of for example, Donald Trump's success in the United States. It makes perfect sense to make sense of Viktor Orban, Modi in India, Jordan in the UK. All these populist leaders, I think, build on identity politics and build on actually, revitalizing and building groups of individuals who were left out from the political process before. As the Democrats and the leftist forces went into the rhetoric of different types of identity politics, LGBT, etc., various issues that didn't resonate among the communities that lost from globalization processes, deindustrialization processes, social dislocation that happened. Those voices that were not heard and were not expressed were expressed by populists. And in that sense, the social identity theory and the leadership perspective absolutely is a perfect tool to make sense of the phenomena of leadership phenomena and of empowerment of populists and the mechanisms involved in that empowerment of populists around the world. Absolutely.
You mentioned Trump, right? Almost inevitably, because we have to mention Trump at least once a day, right? Jeff Kopstein, right, writes, can this framework help us understand the perspective of sort of the normal Russian man in the street, right? When it comes to their positive reaction to Trump's election in 2016, right? He says, American liberals viewed this as a catastrophe, but seen through the lens, the Russian lens of the traumatic 1990s, right? And of course, Trump was getting up on his inaugural and talking about American carnage, right? In a way that is similar in some ways to how Putin tried to, or has succeeded in talking about the 1990s. Is this a case of people thinking, isn't it great you've got your own Putin too, right? Rather than thinking that all of a sudden the U.S. had a pro-Russian president. It was more about a sense of maybe some kind of common choice when it came to trauma.
This is a difficult question. I might not be able to answer it, Jeff. I apologize, because it's, I could see how Trump's leadership could be explained from social identity perspective for the American audiences. But when we talk about support for Trump on the part of Russian audiences, I think other issues come in. And among other issues is probably different types of issues, including the fact that I think it's been traditionally so that Russian leadership elites, who of course conveyed those messages to the public, frequently saw Republicans as being more pragmatically oriented, as opposed to more moralizing and therefore oppositional to Russia Democrats. So that's one sort of historical structural difference in terms of building Russia-US relationship under Democrats and under Republicans. That's one thing. Otherwise, I mean, in terms of stylistic, maybe this populism of Trump and his sort of uninhibited rhetoric might be in some ways also might resonate to a certain extent in Russia. The vulgarity has been quite a feature on Russian political, linguistic, rhetorical scene as well. And the hatred or despise over political correctness in the United States and the cancel culture are very much, I think, prevalent among many Russian intellectuals as well. So people might see him not necessarily just as pro-Russian or more pro-Russian than Democrats, but also just stylistically very different and brave to people would say, to say things the way they are, to call spade a spade, while many others wouldn't do that because of cancel culture or because of political correctness. So those stylistic issues might kick in as well. And I'm sure there are some other reasons too behind that, behind those proclivities towards Trump support in Russia.
Okay. Maxim, if I can, I want to bring you back into the conversation, because I'm listening to a lot of the stuff that Gulnaz has said, and I'm thinking about the book and remembering what you said earlier, and I'm thinking, Gulnaz and I have one job, right, which is to talk to people mostly outside of Russia, right, to help them understand what's going on in Russia. You have a very different job, right? You talk to people outside of Russia as well, right? But you have a job of talking to people in Russia, right, about what's going on and helping them, make their way. But from a perspective that, as you said, I think I get the impression you're holding up a very different mirror to people, right? And so, if I can continue the metaphor of the book, and so I wonder, given this perspective that we've been talking about for the last hour and a bit, right? How does that alter, or does it mean that we have to think differently, or that journalists have to think differently about the challenge that they face, right? So that you can, and this is something we think about, when we're thinking about the U.S. and media bubbles, right? We think about the U.K. as well, right? How can we talk to the people who don't see themselves in the red mirror, right? In a way that allows them to still maintain some kind of a connection, right, and some kind of traction, particularly if they would like to see a different future for Russia, right, than the past. Sorry, can't hear you, Maxim. Just a second. There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sam. That's a great question. And I'll just say a couple words before about Trump, because I just remembered something that my one additional aspect of this popularity, or so-called popularity, of Trump in Russia is that there was this understanding within a certain part of Russian society and the Kremlin that the Kremlin hated Hillary Clinton so much, and it was very, very public. And Trump was a way of getting back at Washington. So Trump was kind of seen as a weapon, and a lot of people, just out of sheer, fun, supported that. Like, okay, have that, deal with this. This is, and we basically don't care who is this Clinton or is this Trump, but Trump is just worse for you, and that was something I remember distinctly during that time. But anyway, yes, getting back to the actual question. Yes, it's a challenge to work in an environment which is so much distorted by heavily curated, as I said before, and this media culture that is state-sponsored and mostly state-run, and it is a huge ecosystem, and we don't really know. No one knows, I'm sure, to what extent people want it, or to what extent they basically react to that and just or treat it as some kind of background noise that they just have to deal with and just live with it. And again, this is also cultural. I remember, I don't know, my mother has been, she would listen to radio all the time. Radio would be on for hours, on and on, and she would just listen to whatever was there. And I'm sure that people of certain age, they would, just because they're used to that, they would listen. Sometimes they would laugh. Sometimes not very often they would take this as at face value. I don't think. It's just something that's going on. But then on the other hand, there are people like us, people who are trying to build other kinds of media. And so I've been with the Vedomosti, which existed for almost 20 years. Well, in a kind of, I've been there for about 15 years. I left some years ago, and so it felt originally as a new platform that is creating a different standard. So it was all about standards. It was standards of fair journalism, distinguishing between fact and opinion, and showing that this is an opinion. We are open about that. We are talking about things that may or may not agree with your views, but yes, this is the kind of thing we're doing, and sometimes we would support some of the government initiatives. Sometimes we would be critical, but we're also raising a whole bunch of voices here, and so that was kind of institutional. At least that was our belief. Try to build a platform that has values, and it remains. People may change, people may go, but certain standards and values remain. So that was something I believe myself, felt very strongly about, and and I thought to a certain extent we succeeded, we built it, but then it proved that you can destroy it. Yes, you can destroy a platform, and standards probably remain in some kind of cloud out there. People understand that, but not on this particular platform anymore. So so now we're back, and now I'm doing something else, a different platform. It is different, and the different people are doing that. It's also a different generation. They're younger. The people who are running the place, they're running Medusa. Most of the editors are younger than myself, and they have different ideas. But again, it feels like another attempt at building an alternative platform, an alternative set of values, not just pushing something to people and trying to persuade them in selling something to them, which my view is the state-run media are doing. They're selling things to people, or trying to make sure people, get in people's heads and get to, they live with this background. And what I believe, probably, I don't know, I'm biased, of course. What I'm trying to do is to be open, and and to say that yes, there are values and there are standards, and where you may not agree, but at least we are trying to show you that there is a different approach to public debate and national conversation, as if we exist in a normal pluralistic environment. That I think is our time.
Okay, well, that gets us into thinking some more about the context for all of this. And there is, first of all, we're coming up about 3 minutes to the hour. We started 15 minutes late. And so if we can have your indulgence, I'm happy to keep going for 15 minutes past the hour, just to continue what I think is a very rich conversation, and I'm enjoying tremendously. But there's two questions that came in that are related to each other. So Peter Payne asks, to what extent do you think that renewed Kremlin attention to the formation of a quote-unquote national ideology is a response to domestic economic woes? Right. More specifically, was Crimea partly a response to declining oil prices? But we've seen, as you mentioned, just the other day, what you've seen on Solovyov, right? This return to talking more about identity and a bit less about policy. But then also Matthew Blackburn asks, first he says, thanks for the presentation, right? But he says, do you think that 2014, 2016, right, sort of represents the peak of the relevance of this kind of master narrative that you're describing, right? In its power to convince and mobilize might be falling, right? And as we've seen Putin's own approval ratings fall, but also as sort of the economic malaise has deepened, right? Referring to the 90s, Matthew says is increasingly relevant, increasingly irrelevant, right, to more and more people, right? Focusing on geopolitical struggles while Russia's living standards fall is maybe less convincing, right? And the Kremlin might be reaching sort of the end of the lifespan of this. And it does strike me, as you mentioned, right? So that the salience of this narrative of pushing back against the 90s, right, really takes hold in a period when Russia's growing, right? So you have a contrast. You have that was bad, now is good. Right now, you're in a period where now is not so good anymore, right? And does that mean that it's harder to use those same reference points?
You would be surprised, right? When we think rationally, that should be the case, right? But that's the power of psychology. On the one hand, to point out that there are sometimes, emotional proclivities or pressures for people to adopt a certain say more positive viewpoints. If social identity theory tells us that our group belonging is effective and should be associated with positive values, that people would want to belong to a group for which they have a positive association. And when there is such a psychologically sort of determined demand, which is universal, by the way, the media feeds into that. So even if the situation today is getting harder, right? What is fed to people, if you look again at infotainment and at Solovyov, there are positive messages. 2 days ago, they celebrated the day of taxation, taxation services, налоговая служба. And the first hour of that conversation was actually proving and showing and bringing Siluanov and Gref and others in to show that taxation service today in Russia is the best in the world. And then Solovyov asks one of the commentators, who is Makarov, Andrei Makarov, he says, one of the best, один из лучших, наверное. And Makarov says, no, the best. Right? This is the first 10 minutes of that conversation where Russians who watch, and here is the trick, right? In order to be open, and you need to, first of all, be a viewer. And we do know that the viewership of television has been falling, not dramatically, not tremendously. But if we look at the medium term, the viewership, and therefore the potency of these narratives is slowly being eroded. I don't think we can talk about that next year no one is going to watch, but the trends that Maxim is talking about, but unfortunately, it's not just trends that Maxim is talking about a real conversation about important domestic issues that are important to individuals. Unfortunately, another big trend is political apathy and the popularity of Nastya Ivleva, right? I mean, the blogger, a YouTube blogger, one of the most famous ones, who conveys the messages of consumerism, beauty, fashion, music, sports, etc., but very apolitical, right? So the the Kremlin is working against the time, and from one perspective, the viewership of TV and therefore the influence is falling on that perspective, and there are alternative media, but I think the political apathy in Russia, which is still widespread and widespread among youth as well, is something that works to the benefit of the Kremlin. And of course, identity politics is part of the story. I think it was a very big part of the story after Crimea, but there are other currents that work still to maintain the structures the way they are, political structures the way they are. I think I'm missing, maybe there was another point I wanted to make, but
okay, well, I do want to move on, actually. So there's a question from Oscar, it's one of our master's students, actually, at the Institute, who goes back to something you started with, which is this, I was almost tempted to think of this in terms of sort of a Russian version of hillbilly elegy, right? Although I don't want to make any assumptions there, right? But he asked, well, what was the main difference in perception that you saw between you and your father, and you and your kids, and maybe between your father and your kids, that led you to further to want to delve into this? If you could sort of tell us a bit more about that. And I might add to that by asking, whether you think that as a result of having gone on this journey yourself and written this book and given this to us, right, whether that has somehow led you to have different kinds of conversations, right, than you had before.
Yeah, so my kids probably were asking me more about Trump than about Putin. So, so they were trying to figure out who should they support in this presidential election in the United States. So my kids are still too very little to talk about. But when I talk about the gap between myself and people who are close to me, I see, first of all, a real focus on appreciating Putin for foreign policy, that he brought Russia into the rank again. And the same thing I saw in my focus group interviews. And that's where very interesting things happen, because I tried to, given this social identity theory idea, I tried to play with trying to put a focus or make the context of conversation in the focus group with people in Samara and in Kazan open for people to speaking from different perspectives. If you talk to people in non-political perspective, when you don't talk about Russian leadership and Russian government and Russia as a country, when you speak local, majority of people asked about policy priorities, they talk about social justice, they talk about economic well-being and salaries and pensions, they talk about dignity of pensioners, they talk about healthcare system. So what concerns that you would think should be central. Mm-hmm. And that's what they talk about when you ask them about local concerns. But what social identity theory teaches us, and how the Kremlin was able to make use of it, is that once you shift to discussing Russia, or you start, I shifted to the discussing leaders and comparing Putin to Yeltsin and stuff like that. And that's where all of a sudden, that whole focus on important policy priorities that are important to each individual in their everyday life, they disappear. Mm-hmm. And the support for Putin is built and is expressed by focusing on status issues, on foreign policy issues, something I see on my dad's part as well, and something I see on a lot of people who I speak to Russia as well. So and this is what, again, the identity and the psychology of it is, that the salience of specific issues and the basis of support could be at a different level, different from the salience of other issues. So as if there are different cognitive realms that exist. And the interesting thing, and I discussed this not quite in the book but in the paper, people do not see these things connected, that the economic downturn is very much associated with the assertive foreign policy and Crimea. People don't see that linkage. It exists in different realms, right? And only some people see that, right? So for Russians, they live comfortably, and this is our, again, universal psychological trait, that we are very different. We can combine very contradictory, dualistic, and sometimes contradictory ideas in our head, and that happens again everywhere, not just Russians. That we can desire a better economy and better healthcare system and better governance, accountability, and speak about corruption, but we might also support Putin very much because the status of the international status of the state, the perception of our collective identity matters to us as much, and sometimes even more so than our concerns, which are more of everyday nature. And again, I don't know where I started, but I think I tried to make that point, that it's quite a dualistic coexistence of different things in our minds that Putin and the Kremlin were able to, use to their own perspective, and that are trying to still maintain those strategies because they have worked. They might not work as well today, and people might be turning away and listening. So I agree with Max on this, of course, that the more people look into other media venues, and the more they get exposed to other ideas, the better it is for Russia's future. But we are still in the situation where not all people are all open and engaged. And again, economic struggles and unfortunately, the dynamics of economic development in Russia are not in the direction of creating the demand for such conversation. Frequently, economic struggles lead to, as we know, involution and some, the individual strategies of responding to those struggles, where people do not even have sometimes time to engage in community events, and do not see it as pragmatic to engage in collective action if what they need to do is go and maybe, I don't know, grow potato fields or whatnot.
Sure. Okay, we have one small question, just a factual question. Alexander Mihailovich asks when the comments about Russian exceptionalism from Solovyov were that you referenced. Do you remember when those were?
Comments from Solovyov about Russian exceptionalism come out every day. So whatever evening with Solovyov you look at, that's, I guess, the important thing in my book, that I'm trying to talk about these foundational frames. So other events are brought in to support those foundational events, and those foundational events or frames, not events, frames and ideas, I guess, are that, Russia is better than the West, Russia is more moral, Russia is this, Russian, roads are now the best, and Russian taxation system is the best, and Russian attention or appreciation of history is much better than the way look at the, the hypocrisy that they discuss for 2 hours in these programs. So, but the recent one that I've mentioned about taxation services was from 22nd of November. And if you look at 23rd of November, you see Russian exceptionalism discussed in terms of Russia's victory in World War II.
Okay. I think that brings us to a fairly logical conclusion. So I want to take a moment to thank everybody. Before we part, one little announcement. We will be back for what I think will be the last event of this academic semester in early December. Stay tuned for the exact date, but we're going to have another double book talk with Andrei Soldatov and Irina Buragan with their book The Compatriots, together with Catherine Belton and her book Putin's People. So we'll be looking at two two sides of the same coin, hopefully in an interesting way. So do stay tuned for that, and please do join us. In the meantime, please join me in a digital long distance thanks to Maxim and to Gulnaz. The book is available wherever good books are sold. So please do go look for it. It's out there. Unlike most academic books, it's affordable. Also, unlike most academic books, it's readable. So please do go get yourself a copy and read it. And we'll continue the conversation shortly. So thanks again.
Thank you, everyone, for
coming.
Thank
you. Thanks so much.
Maxim, thank you. Sam, thank you
for
organizing.
Thank you.
That was good talking to you guys.
Sorry?
It was good talking to you. Good seeing you.
Yeah, good seeing you. Absolutely. Where are you now? Are you in Vilnius or?
Yeah, this is.
Are you in Vilnius? Are you hanging out with Olga, Irisov, and Anton?
Yes, they are somewhere